On May 13th, 1787, George Washington arrived in Philadelphia. He was there to join the assembly of men who were contemplating some kind of substantive change in the government of the young American nation. What that change would be was uncertain. Some hoped for a complete overhaul. Others hoped for a far more limited discussion of how better to regulate interstate commerce. He arrived to great ceremony, as he nearly always did. He was escorted to the ferry that took him across the Schuylkill River by 3 generals, 2 colonels, 2 majors of the Continental Army that he had commanded just a few years before. There were bells, there were cheers. He made arrangements to stay in a boarding house, but he wound up staying in the finest house in Philadelphia, the guest of Robert Morris, at that time, perhaps the richest man in America, and soon to be in debtor's prison. But nearly as soon as he arrived, he paid a call on the president of Pennsylvania, Dr. Franklin. Franklin was at that time the president of the Supreme Executive Council in Pennsylvania, making him essentially as close to the governor of the state as their 1776 Constitution allowed. These were the 2 most famous Americans. A third place in that race would have been difficult to even determine. It would have been a distant third. As the Revolution was just underway a decade earlier, it would be fair to say that only George Washington and Ben Franklin had truly national reputations. They had met only a few times before, around the time of the Braddock Expedition in 1755, for a couple of times, for 6 weeks as members of the Continental Congress before the Revolution had even begun, and a brief meeting not long after. And they met now, knowing that their reputations, as vast as they were, might be essential to a successful outcome of this new convention here in Philadelphia. A few weeks before the meeting, Franklin had written to a friend in France that the Articles of Confederation, the present framework of government, the Constitution in a sense that was about to be replaced, was, according to Franklin, generally blamed as not having given sufficient powers to Congress, the federal head. A convention is therefore appointed to revise that Constitution and propose a better. The call for this convention had come at another specially called meeting, one that had been made in September 1786 in Annapolis, Maryland, by representatives of the largest state of the Union, Virginia. The Annapolis meeting had been attended by only 5 states, and they were there essentially to discuss trade. The only real outcome of this Annapolis convention was to propose a later gathering. And Alexander Hamilton actually penned the resolution that was adopted to devise such further provisions as to them necessary to render the Constitution of the federal government adequate to the exigencies of the Union. 7 states, led of course by Virginia, had appointed delegates to meet in Philadelphia when Congress, the Confederation Congress, the current national government, passed a resolution encouraging all of the states to do so. Still, this is early in 1787, before the convention has begun, Washington is hesitating. He's not sure that he's going to travel to Philadelphia. He had already declined to join a meeting of the Society of the Cincinnati, that veterans organization that was founded at the end of the war, and he didn't want to become involved in a futile endeavor. He didn't want to put his reputation at risk. And there were also other issues. His brother had died in January. His mother and sister were not well. Still, he consented to come to Philadelphia in May of 1787. A couple of reasons. He knew firsthand, as the former commander-in-chief, just how weak the central government was and how it might put the whole national experiment at risk. And second, and this is one that's easy to forget when we look at Washington, he didn't want to give the impression that he had given up on Republican government. Things are struggling. There's been a near civil uprising in Massachusetts not long before. And here was an attempt to try to save the framework of Republican government in the United States, and Washington didn't want to look as if he was cutting it loose. He left Mount Vernon for Philadelphia on May 9th, and that's when he meets Franklin. He met him the day before the convention was set to begin, and that's actually what I want to talk about today. What happened when they got together? How did they decide to debate? How did they decide to organize themselves? What were the rules and the framework by which they came up with the rules and the framework for our new national government? That day on May 14th, 1787, there were only a handful of delegates ready to begin. 2 states had shown up with full delegations, Virginia and the kind of home turf of Pennsylvania. They met at a place that was already beginning to be called Independence Hall at the time. It's still standing. But at that time, it was still known simply as the State House. It was the building in which the Declaration of Independence had been drafted, adopted, and signed. One of these states, Virginia, was ably represented by the man who showed up first, James Madison. He had been in town for 10 days already, preparing, reading. Pennsylvania's delegation was also there and beginning to meet with people like Madison and the other delegates from Virginia, such as George Wythe, who were already in town. It would take a while from this point forward. It was about a 2-week journey to get to Philadelphia from New Hampshire, about 3 weeks from Georgia. So on May 14th, there was no quorum. On May 15th, there was still no quorum, but more delegates were beginning to trickle in. By May 17th, the last of the Virginia delegation had arrived. This was George Mason, the guy who had drafted the first Declaration of Rights and the principal author of the Virginia Constitution. And the delegation from South Carolina arrived, which was bound to be enormously influential, led by John Rutledge, Charles Pinckney. On May 18th, New Yorkers arrived. Robert Yates, who would go on to basically leave in a huff from the convention, unhappy with what was being drafted, and Alexander Hamilton, who was one of the leading intellects of the new framework. For another week, they waited as more delegates were trickling in. Finally, on May 25th, more than half of the states of the Union were represented when New Jersey's delegation arrived. Even before the full delegations had arrived from all of these states, it was clear what one of the tensions was going to be, that is small states versus large states. This is the classic showdown at the convention. Another one is equally significant and something that could fill lecture after lecture, and that's the distinction between slave states and states that were beginning to eliminate slavery. But this dispute between small states and large ones was an essential one, because under the Articles of Confederation, all states had an equal vote, regardless of the population. And on especially significant issues where the Articles of Confederation required a unanimous decision, it essentially meant that every state, from Little Rhode Island and Little Delaware to the largest state of Virginia, had a veto, essentially, over any decisions that could be made. And this was a convention that was called by a convention that had been called by Virginians, by far the largest state, that had been called by a resolution passed by a New Yorker, also a massively large state, dwarfing tiny Delaware and Rhode Island. And George Reed of Delaware, 4 days before the quorum was even reached, was already aware of what was about to happen here. He said, "Small states must," and this is a quote from George Reed of Delaware, "keep a strict watch upon the movements and propositions from the larger states, who will probably combine to swallow up the smaller ones by addition, division, and impoverishment." Essentially, he was right. The small states were hoping to do something like this, not swallow them up by impoverishment, but find a way to have a new national government that wasn't simply voting state by state, but where the population of each state actually mattered. Pennsylvania and Virginia were already asking whether small states should have the same vote as tiny Delaware. Delaware had a population of 60,000. Virginia had nearly 750,000. Pennsylvania delegates were ready to press on this point, that at this convention even, we should not be voting state by state. Delegates from Virginia knew that to broach the issue now would jeopardize the convention, and they scuttled this Pennsylvania proposal. So for the rest of the convention, they would vote, each state having an equal vote. Organizing the convention. Well, Virginia did its best to set the agenda. The delegates met, according to George Mason, when he wrote on May 20th, for 2 or 3 hours a day, just the Virginia delegation, to form a proper correspondence of sentiments, as he put it. And they came up with what's called the Virginia Plan, which essentially became the framework that debates jumped off from. Point by point, it described what the executive should look like, what the legislature should look like, what powers the federal government should have. But the Virginia Plan, the rival New Jersey Plan, Charles Pinckney of South Carolina also came up with a plan. These aren't the subjects that I want to talk about today. I essentially want to lay the foundation for our exploration of the Constitution by looking at how the people that came up with the Constitution decided to organize themselves. What rules did they come up with for debate, for procedure overall? And the Constitution is essentially a procedural framework. And here we have a chance to look at how the drafters of this procedural framework decided to organize themselves. Essentially, the men who were present there were experienced in parliamentary procedure that had been in practice in colonial and revolutionary assemblies from the very beginning. And the first thing that they knew they had to do was to elect a couple of important officers, a president and a secretary. There were exactly 2 men who might be called upon to preside, and we've already been introduced to them, George Washington and Ben Franklin. The Pennsylvania delegates, almost certainly at Franklin's suggestion, although no historical record proves this, decided to keep this difficult, awkward choice, choosing between Franklin and Washington, from facing a convention that already had plenty to worry about. And so Franklin wanted to himself nominate George Washington as president of the convention. The first day that they were able to meet in an official meeting after the full delegations had shown up from more than half of the states was marred by bad weather. The 81-year-old Franklin couldn't travel to the State House that day. And so his friend and fellow Pennsylvanian Robert Morris nominated the former commander-in-chief to preside. He was, of course, elected unanimously. An official secretary was also chosen to record a journal of the proceedings. This is Major William Jackson of Georgia. We know that he did a terrible job at this, and thankfully a handful of members also kept notes. The most important by far were James Madison's. The 36-year-old Virginian sat very close to the president's chair, kept shorthand notes as each speech was made, and he painstakingly fleshed them out every night, often borrowing copies of the speeches from the speakers themselves. After electing the officers, the 7 delegations who were present at the time elected a committee to draft the rules of procedure. There were 3 members of the committee: George Wythe of Virginia, who was probably the greatest classical scholar in America at the time, the first professor of law at William & Mary. He was Thomas Jefferson's legal mentor. Alexander Hamilton of New York, and then Charles Pinckney of South Carolina, one of the youngest delegates. They took 3 days before they reported, and on May 28th, the topic of discussion was this: how to organize the convention. What they came up with essentially echoed the rules of Confederation Congress. They'd already agreed that voting would be by states. This was how they elected the officers, for instance. But the first rule in the committee report confirmed this, and then goes on this committee report goes on to essentially describe point by point how to maintain civility and decorum. There were rules that were standard in these kinds of gatherings about not speaking twice on a subject until everyone who wants to speak has had a chance, not talking or even reading books or papers while other people are speaking, something that I'm sure was breached, and not passing between the speaker and the president. Everyone was to face the president while speaking. These kinds of policies. There were 2, though, that stood out. First of all, they adopted a policy of secrecy. Members were formally prohibited from discussing what happened there with anyone at all. This wasn't as conspiratorial as it might sound. Only in the 1790s would public transparency for public assemblies become a common practice. The city of Philadelphia, might have added to the potential conspiratorial look of this policy of secrecy by actually appointing armed guards to stand outside the State House to keep eavesdroppers from getting too close. Madison and Washington both spoke out openly and directly about the importance of this secrecy policy, though. They both argued, and they did it directly in front of the convention. One time Washington, in anger, called out the convention when he had heard that something might have been leaked. They argued that collective seclusion was necessary to remove themselves from external pressures to achieve some kind of real deliberation. It was only in seclusion that they could talk through the issues, that they could reach compromises without fear of displaying to the world what kinds of bargains are happening in the assembly. It was, for Madison anyway, in part an extension of a principle that led him to favor secret ballots, really. One's political voice was less apt to be corrupted if it could be expressed in secret. Many on the outside were very critical of the secrecy of the convention. Men such as Thomas Jefferson, writing from France, told his friend John Adams, "I am sorry they began their deliberations by so abominable a precedent as that of tying up the tongues of their members." He was getting news trickling in to Europe at this time. "Nothing can justify this example but the innocence of their intentions and the ignorance of the value of public discussions. I have no doubt that all of their other measures will be good and wise." They also adopted a second important rule, what has been called the rule of mutability. It's a largely forgotten delegate from North Carolina, Richard Dobbs Speight, who pushed this. And what it was it allowed the convention to change their mind. That is, if they had voted, they could reconsider a vote already taken by the majority without any special parliamentary tricks. The Wythe-Hamilton-Pinckney Committee took this suggestion, reworked it into the larger rules of committee, and it helped to hold the convention together. Every time that things didn't go one's way, delegates who had misgivings after the Virginia plan, for instance, essentially became the framework of debate by a vote of 7-3, they knew that they could have future opportunities to swing the vote back their way. Speaking of committees, a lot of the debates happened in what's a special legislative contrivance called the Committee of the Whole. It allowed everyone in the room all of a sudden to become a committee instead of the full assembly, and they could allow for freer debate in that kind of a setting. George Washington would step aside. Nathaniel Gorham of Massachusetts would take the chair. And again, it allowed people to know that no matter what was decided, they'd have another shot at it, because what was adopted was officially just a committee report, and the full assembly would have another chance to discuss the matter. How did all this procedural organization work out? Well, it worked out very well. The secrecy policy did allow for free discussion and compromise, and there were worries about what was happening in the State House, but it wasn't nearly as conspiratorial as it might seem from a 21st century perspective. It did put some pressure on them. They couldn't complain to their friends and family about what was going on. And some people did just leave. But in the end, the procedures allowed for healthy, full debate. And of the 55 delegates who spent some time at the convention, more than half, that is 29, were there for every or nearly every debate. A total of 39 missed no more than a couple of weeks. And 42 of the 55 who came and left over the course of the summer were there on the last day, including the 3 men, Elbridge Gerry, and 2 Virginians, George Mason and Edmund Randolph, who attended but couldn't bring themselves to sign. The rules of procedure laid the foundation for the debates and the decisions to come, and out of these rules came the rules for our government to this day, the U.S. Constitution. Thank you.
Freedom 101 is made possible by generous support from the University of Oklahoma Alumni Association. Freedom 101 is a program of the Institute for the American Constitutional Heritage at the University of Oklahoma. For more videos and podcasts, visit freedom.ou.edu.